So now the Right Honorable Ambassador David Wallen will arrive. I would like to ask the audience to rise and give him a round of applause in order to welcome him. Please take your seat. Before introducing the ambassador, Mr. Nagai, the president of the university, is going to give opening remarks.
David Warren.
The Honorable David Warren, Ambassador, thank you very much for coming. In spite of your busy schedule to come to Chuo University, I would like to express my appreciation to you for your coming to our university today. Ambassador is fluent in Japanese, so I'm sure that he understands everything I say. Now, the students, I'd like to talk about the International Week for the students. International Week. The first one was we had the France Week, the first half. This month we have the UK Week, and after this we have US and German weeks as well. Why are we having such international weeks? I do hope that you have good understanding why we are having these international weeks. The environment surrounding all of you, all of us, what kind of environment are we in? You are learning in university. In the future, as you go into the society and earn your living and live for yourself, and the career design, you have to have good career design. And based upon the career design that you have developed, you learn and you polish your capability as a human being so that you'll be able to have firm root in the society. So wherever you go in the world, you can live by yourself. Yes. In order for you to be able to do so, you are here to study, and your university life is that for that purpose. Now, when you start to work in the society, many people will eventually work in a company, and the entry sheet, the selection for the entry sheet, whether you are qualified to submit entry sheet for recruitment, whether you are a global person or not, that is the first gateway or the first important point. What kind of linguistic skills you have, whether you have experience living outside of Japan, experiences outside Japan, and about the Japanese culture, and about your experiences in Japan, you are able to communicate to the people outside of Japan. All these are you are asked to answer all these questions. You are living in an era when you are required to satisfy all these conditions. At your university, as you will be looking outside Japan, we are holding such international weeks as this one. Ambassador David Warren's speech will be talking about a topic which is timely for the International Week. As I was speaking with Ambassador is well versed with the situation in Japan, and he has deep recognition of Japan. In that sense, his speech will be very meaningful and helpful for your future career. With this, I'd like to conclude my opening remarks. Thank you.
So now I'd like to give you the brief background. I would like to ask the ambassador to give a speech, but before that,
to you today, His Excellency Mr. David Warren, Her Majesty's Ambassador to Japan. Mr. Warren was born in 1952 and educated at Epsom College and Exeter College, Oxford, where he read English literature. He's a member of the Japan Society Council and the Royal Society for Asian Affairs. And as Mr. Warren will tell you in a few minutes, he began his Foreign Service career in 1975 when he joined the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Then after 2 years of full-time Japanese language study, he served in his first posting to the British Embassy in Tokyo from 1978 to 1981. Returning to London in the early 1980s, Mr. Warren dealt with economic relations and trade between the European Union and Japan, as well as multilateral trade policy issues more generally. After a 4-year posting in Kenya, in Africa, he again returned to London until 1993, when he came back to Japan for his second posting to the British Embassy here, serving until 1998 as commercial counselor. He returned to London again and held a series of positions of increasing responsibility until July 2008, when he took up the post in which he serves to this day as British Ambassador to Japan. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Ambassador David Warren.
Thank you very much for that very kind welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David Warren, a British ambassador to Japan. I speak a little Japanese, but today I would like to speak in English.
It's a very great honor to be asked to speak today on the subject of the importance of international relations. And it's a particular pleasure to be giving this speech in Chuo University, which has had such close links with the United Kingdom since its foundation as the English Law School in 1885. Last year, I had the great pleasure of attending the 125th anniversary of Chuo, and was part of a ceremony that honored the very close connections between this university and the Middle Temple in London. And one of the themes of my speech today is the importance of international relationships of this kind. So it's good to be able to talk about this subject in a distinguished university that is a symbol of such close international contact. I have written at this point in my speech that I should start with a few words about myself and my career, but you've already heard all about me and my career, so I really should not repeat what the Master of Ceremonies so kindly said, except to say that in the 36 years that I've been a British diplomat, my career has very much concentrated on Asian and particularly Japanese affairs. Most diplomats have a mixture of careers which are a mixture of specialization, Japan obviously in my case, and jobs which give them a broader range of experience. But the common theme in all the work that I've done has been about building good international relations as a basis for a country to promote its interests worldwide, and at the same time be part of a process whereby the world becomes a more prosperous and a stable place. So I want to talk about those principles in this speech. As somebody who spent his career dealing with international relations, it's a good discipline to ask yourself why they really matter. And I think it's important to start with that question because it's not obvious to everybody that they do matter. It's striking in the United Kingdom when political crises develop, when the Prime Minister is out of the country on an international trip. It's quite common for the media to question why the head of government is travelling abroad and not in the United Kingdom dealing with whatever the crisis may be. The value of senior politicians engaging in international activities is not automatically accepted by a large number of people. Indeed, I sometimes think we see this even more dramatically in Japan, where it can be extraordinarily difficult for government ministers even to get permission to travel when the Diet is in session. Perhaps, paradoxically, this is part of a syndrome which is even more in evidence at a time of international volatility. We are all living through a period of immense global economic uncertainty. The forces of globalization, whether these are international financial transactions, global business activities, the use of information technology to store, transmit, and disseminate huge quantities of information across national boundaries, or the growing awareness of international problems that can only be tackled by closer international cooperation, like climate change, for example, or terrorism. This phenomenon is likely to encourage people towards a more nationalistic view of the world, clinging to those values and experiences that they know best, and turning away from a more internationally focused approach to these problems, as it is likely to bring nations closer together. The big paradox of our time, I think, is that in an age when it is possible for people to travel more easily, to share information more readily, and to understand foreign languages, cultures, and societies in infinitely more detail than has ever been possible in the past, there's a greater tendency towards nationalistic thinking and a greater reluctance to recognize the importance of international relations than I can recall throughout my lifetime. Some analysts of international relations see a tension between the main purpose of diplomacy, whether it should be to promote national interests or whether the focus should be on promoting shared values. With the growth of the nation state from the 17th and 18th centuries onwards, and the dramatic increase in nation states around the world in the course of the last century, particularly following the decolonization movements after the Second World War, this debate, interests versus values, has become a very intense intellectual argument. Let me tell you what I think, looking at it from a diplomat's perspective. And I am a civil servant who spent his life dealing with international questions of this kind. On the one hand, the main purpose of a nation's foreign policy has to be to promote its interests around the world. This means maximizing influence over other governments' actions and policies, presenting one's own country as attractively and as compellingly as possible in order to support this process. I want the United Kingdom to be seen by the Japanese government and the Japanese people as a loyal friend and partner of Japan, as a source of high-quality companies providing the very best goods and services in the Japanese market, as a potential center for Japanese companies wanting to invest in Europe, as an attractive tourist destination for Japanese travelers, as a center of excellence in the fields of science, culture, education, as well as a source of influential and interesting ideas and values. And of course, my fellow ambassadors in Tokyo from other countries will want to follow a very similar course in respect of their own national interests. And my good friend and colleague, the Japanese ambassador in London, will want to follow a very similar course in promoting Japan to the best possible advantage in the United Kingdom and he is doing, I should say, a marvelous job in that regard. And in pursuing the national interest, I also want to influence Japanese government thinking on foreign policy issues where I believe we have a shared interest in particular approach. I'll go on to set this out in a little more detail later, but I'm fortunate to be an ambassador in a country which, on the whole, thinks very similarly to the United Kingdom in so many areas. There are relatively few areas of difference between us. But my major responsibility as the British ambassador is to promote Britain and British interests as actively as I possibly can. Having said all that about interests, of course, it's impossible to divorce this activity, to separate it from a broader responsibility. As I said earlier, the number of international issues and problems that have developed in recent years and can only be tackled on a global basis by nation states and by groups of countries acting together has radically increased and made the importance of working effectively together much greater. We all know, for example, that climate change, or to give it a more honest name, global warming, has developed to a degree that will make it impossible for us to keep global temperature increases to within 2 degrees and move to a low carbon future without international coordinated action. Now, the way in which we try to do this involves complex political discussions on a very wide range of scientific, technological, economic and financial issues. But the central task, which is to save the planet, can only be achieved by nations working in concert with each other. The same is true in another area on the issue of non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, of working towards effective eventual nuclear disarmament. The same is also true in areas such as the international financial sphere, where the group of 20 major economies, both developed and developing economies, are actively addressing ways of bringing greater stability to the international economy. And this is a pressing need at a time of massive debt in certain countries and very slow growth throughout the developed world. The risks of destabilizing financial activity because of the impact of individual countries possibly defaulting on their debt, and this will have a very serious impact on international financial institutions whose influence extends well beyond national boundaries. These are not only problems which need to be tackled by countries working together. They're problems which can only be tackled in the context of an effective international framework for such discussions. And I believe that there is no way out of this responsibility for any country. The idea of retreating behind national borders in what the US administration in the 19th century called splendid isolation is no longer viable. Even countries like China, which have traditionally identified their national interests as overriding their stake in contributing to an international economic system in which global issues can be discussed and resolved, are now acknowledging that the one is not possible without the other. So this all means that the role of diplomats and specialists in international relations becomes more, not less, important. Let me quote you the words of the British Foreign Secretary, the Foreign Minister of the United Kingdom, William Hague. He gave a speech last month to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London, in which he said, I'm going to quote a paragraph of his speech, "The world out there is not conducting a seminar on foreign policy. Out there are nations advancing their own interests, ideas which promote violent extremism, wars we must prevent, new threats we must anticipate, treaties we must negotiate, and opportunities we must seize. There is no inevitable progression towards a greater ease of agreement at international bodies. Shocks, crises, setbacks, and conflict are all too frequent, and we need diplomacy to help mitigate them. The art of building confluences of interests with nations whose view of the world is very different from our own is not something of the past, but a crucial national advantage that we must preserve and strengthen for the future. And he went on in this very interesting speech, which you can read if you want to on the website of the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. He went on to argue that, if anything, we now have to work even harder to persuade others to support the things we believe in. For example, on human rights. The main thrust of the British coalition government, which has been in power in the United Kingdom since May last year, and its foreign policy, is to develop strong relations with diverse countries, strong bilateral relations with many countries, on the principle that the world is not concentrating into regional blocks, but becoming a network of overlapping alliances and connections among countries we need to understand and to be able to influence. We need to understand and influence them not just in pursuit of our own security and prosperity, but also for global agreements on the wider issues that I've already mentioned. I imagine that in some respects the image of diplomacy is still a little stuck in the world of the 19th century and of nation states competing for influence within the framework laid down by the Congress of Vienna after the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. The idea of a balance of power, preventing any one nation state from exerting excessive power or influence over others, lay at the heart of 19th century diplomacy. But by the beginning of the 20th century, with the rise of nationalism in Europe and the failure of the traditional diplomatic structures to avoid conflict, which led to the terrible First World War and shocking loss of life, the first truly global war involving conflict in every part of the world, and leading directly or indirectly to the collapse of both the Russian and the Austro-Hungarian empires, attention turned to the importance of creating an international framework for preserving peace and stability. And the story of the 20th century, I think, has been a story of countries finding increasingly examples of national interests and national sovereignty being pooled, at first not very successfully and then later with more success, to create a more effective and powerful international framework within which international relations can be managed. The first attempt to do this was immediately after the First World War with the creation of the League of Nations. It was founded as a result of the Paris Peace Conference that ended the First World War, and it was the first attempt to create an international organization with this specific goal. At its height in the mid-1930s, it had nearly 60 members, but ultimately it failed in its prime purpose, which was to preserve peace and avoid another world war. And the idea of collective security, which formed the basis of the League, was not strong enough to withstand the need for individual members of the League to act in a way that preserved and promoted their national interests, and conflict ultimately was the result. Following the Second World War, the Allied powers came together to create a new body to replace the League, the United Nations. And the United Nations continues the principle which was enshrined in the original League of Nations that international affairs should be institutionalized. Of course, the structure of the United Nations reflects the balance of power 66 years ago at the end of World War II, with the 5 victorious allies becoming permanent members of the Security Council, with vetoes over United Nations resolutions and activity. And it's increasingly acknowledged, and we in the British government feel this very strongly, that these structures need to change in order to reflect the way in which the world has changed since 1945. One of the reforms that we should like to see in the United Nations Security Council is in its enlargement to include countries who now exert much greater international power and influence than they did 65 years ago, who we think have the right to be included in the governance of international relations. And we would very much like to see Japan become a permanent member of the Security Council when eventually that body is expanded and reformed. But the important point to remember, however, is that with the creation of the United Nations, we now have, and we have had for 65 years, an international institution that provides a deliberative assembly where international issues can be discussed, and with the Security Council, a body responsible for maintaining peace and security between countries, which represents an important and constructive influence in international political and humanitarian affairs. We've also seen other examples of countries coming together collectively and pooling sovereignty. With the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, we've seen the development of an institution assuming the responsibility of collective defense against attack by any external party. NATO was initially focused on what was perceived to be the threat of the Soviet Union against Western Europe during the Cold War, but in recent years its activities have been expanded into other centers of conflict like Afghanistan and Libya. In the 1950s, in the economic sphere, the countries of Western Europe, who had been so ravaged by the Second World War, began to pool their economic sovereignty in what was originally called the European Coal and Steel Community. And this, in turn, developed into the European Economic Community and later the European Union. And the principle underlying this development was that the security and prosperity of individual countries is more likely to be safeguarded by collective action to pursue common interests rather than by competition for resources, influence and advantage, which may lead to argument and conflict. And the creation of international structures that embody this sense of collective defense or economic management provides a framework within which difficult issues, issues on which countries disagree, issues on which there are disputes, can be discussed and hopefully resolved. For all the many difficulties the European Union has encountered, many of which we are reading about today with the problems in the Eurozone, as the interests of at first 6 countries, then 9, then 10, then 12, then 15, then 25, and 4 years ago, with the accession of the 2 most recent members of the European Union, 27 countries, the ability of the Union to embody increasing cooperation in a wide range of economic, social, security, and other areas does represent a model for international collective action. It's very interesting that there is here in Japan, I think, the beginnings of a discussion of the need for Asia to develop similar structures as a means of managing potential areas of dispute and difficulty, both economic and defense related, in the decades ahead. So far, we don't really have in Asia the same sort of structures that we have in Europe to do this, although, of course, there is the grouping of ASEAN, there are some additional groupings based on ASEAN, there is the East Asia Summit, there are various communities beginning to develop which may provide a nucleus of this type of international framework. And I was very struck by the importance that the US Secretary of State Clinton attached to this specific area of work in a recent article that she has written on Asia and the US relationship with Asia in Foreign Policy magazine. Now, I've spoken a little about the history of international relations over the last 100 years and the way in which member states, individual member states' activities have begun to be replaced by more collective activity. But I must also stress an important point, which is often forgotten by some diplomats or observers of diplomatic activity. Ultimately, all foreign policy relates strongly to a country's domestic policy interests. The strength of a nation's diplomatic activity will be directly related to its economic strength. And that is why so much of the work of the British Foreign Office, of the British Embassy in Tokyo, which I head, supports what we describe internally as the United Kingdom's prosperity agenda. The largest single section in the embassy, which I'm the leader, is that which promotes trade and investment links between the United Kingdom and Japan. We also have a very active economic and financial section, which monitors developments in the financial markets and supports closer links between British and Japanese banks and finance houses. Our climate change and energy section works closely with the Japanese government and other organizations on our joint aspiration to move towards a low-carbon future, and also identifies areas of potential cooperation in this area that could help to support low-carbon activity, which is one of the fastest-growing areas of both our economies. And our science and innovation section looks at areas of research and development, which in a few years' time will be feeding through into the commercial marketplace and providing opportunities for companies to exploit. Of course, in addition to all of that, our work on foreign policy and defence issues is very important. But at the heart of the British government's strategy is the need to manage the British economy effectively, which means currently in the UK, reducing the size of the government's financial deficit and the debt payments it needs to make in order to pay for that, and helping the British economy to grow again so as to create jobs and wealth for the country. And that is why the work of our trade, investment and economic teams is so important in identifying areas of potential partnership that will help to create prosperity both for Britain and Japan. I'm a diplomat who spent much of his life dealing with trade and investment issues. So I attach particular importance to this area of our work, because it's the area which connects diplomacy, which can sometimes seem a rather rarefied and elitist activity, most directly with issues of interest and concern to the man or the woman in the street in the United Kingdom. But I don't think that the UK is alone in this. I've been struck by how other diplomatic services have followed the lead of the British Foreign Office in identifying these areas of work as high priorities. Former Japanese Foreign Minister Maehara, when he was Foreign Minister a year ago, identified economic diplomacy as one of the DPJ coalition government's highest foreign policy priorities in his reorientation of the Gaimashō's work last autumn. And economic diplomacy also features very strongly in successive US Secretaries of State's statements about the State Department's activities. It's sometimes said that a country has the foreign policy it can afford. So that's why the two areas of work, in my view, cannot be divided, and why a government's economic strategy lies at the heart of its long-term ability to influence international affairs. Now, I've talked a little about the relationship between the United Kingdom and Japan in my speech, and in the last third of what I have to say today, I'd like to discuss this in a little more detail. As I've already said, Britain and Japan have an amazingly strong and friendly relationship. Indeed, we sometimes say to each other that the main problem we have to face is that there are no problems in the relationship. And that means that we have successfully, over the years, resolved a lot of our historical differences, especially over overt barriers to trade and investment, and we think alike on a very wide range of foreign policy issues. For example, it's fascinating to note that the United Kingdom and Japan, I think, vote along very similar lines in the United Nations, rarely disagreeing, and with a greater level of agreement, I'm told by the Japanese Foreign Ministry, than you see between the UK and the United States, or between Japan and the United States. And this must tell us something about our common values, as well as the fact that we have very shared interests. There's a very strong historical background to this relationship. As Japan opened up to the rest of the world in the aftermath of the Meiji Restoration in the second half of the 19th century, Britain became a close partner across a wide range of activity. It was a formal ally of Japan in the days of the UK-Japan alliance from 1902 until the Washington Treaty of 1922. It's encouraging to note how modern Japanese politicians, including Prime Minister Noda, often speak warmly of the UK-Japan alliance as an example of the importance of international relationships and safeguarding, the importance of safeguarding these relationships carefully. Of course, the relationship between Britain and Japan in the 20th century, we have to be honest, reflects the failure of diplomacy as well as its success, with the deterioration of relations between our two countries in the 1920s and 1930s, and the tragic and violent conflict of the Second World War, which left inevitably a bitter memory in Japan, in the United Kingdom towards Japan for some years. But the period since the Second World War has seen the rebirth of this relationship and its development in the close partnership we see today across a very wide range of government, parliamentary, professional, and human exchange. Closer trade and investment links, as I've said, lie at the heart of this, but they're not the whole of the story. I'm constantly impressed and excited as ambassador to Japan by the very wide range of activity that I become part of and am privileged to endorse and support. Whether in the cultural field, for example, this week's two British laureates in the annual Premium Imperiale Awards by the Japan Art Association, or the recent visit of the Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir John Beddington, to attend the Science and Technology in Society Forum in Kyoto at the beginning of October, or the many trade promotional activities that take place at the British Embassy. This month alone, I've been part of activities to promote British clothing, British music, major industrial, financial firms, launching new products and new relationships in the Japanese market. There's an enormous amount of activity going on. And all of this activity takes place against the background of increasingly aligned thinking on the big issues which face the world. That's a very powerful base for a partnership to develop. Of course, we will always think from different positions on some issues. In Afghanistan, for instance, where the United Kingdom troops continue to play a major role in the NATO-led ISAF force engaging with the Taliban and working for long-term stability and security for the new Afghan government, we recognize why it is not possible for Japan to deploy its own military assets in support of this operation. And at the same time, we're very grateful for the Japanese government's commitment to economic development of Afghanistan through the disbursement of $5 billion worth of aid. We think along similar lines on most of the major foreign policy dossiers. The importance of preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons. The importance of supporting Libya's transition after more than 40 years of dictatorial rule to becoming a stable and democratic state, where Japan and the UK are playing a full part in the Friends of Libya group. The importance of making progress towards a two-state solution on the Israel-Palestinian conflict as the cornerstone of the Middle East peace process and the securing of eventual peace and stability in that region. In all these areas, Britain and Japan think alike. And we similarly support the Japanese government's position on North Korea, where we want to see the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula, the resumption of the six-party talks with that objective in view, and a satisfactory response to the long-standing and distressing issue of the Japanese hostages kidnapped by North Korea in the 1970s and 1980s, which is a profound abuse of human rights and for which no satisfactory explanation has ever been given. And I'll say it again, we very much hope that Japan at some point may become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Not only is it important for the Security Council to reflect current historical realities, but it's also important that Japan's sensible, pragmatic, progressive and constructive influence in world affairs should be felt more consistently in the work of the United Nations. We've got so many shared values. Are there areas where we differ? I think there are a few, and I want to range in this talk as widely and as candidly as possible. So let me mention one or two areas of Japanese policy where there are some differences between us. I've said that economic prosperity lies at the heart of what we do, and nothing is more important in that area for us at the moment than the discussions which are currently underway to move towards an economic partnership agreement between the EU and Japan. We strongly support these discussions. We hope that they will lead to formal negotiations opening at some early date towards this objective. While it is true that overt barriers to trade in Japan are very few, Japan does still remain a highly regulated and a very complex market for foreign firms, and a difficult market in which to invest. It's striking that foreign direct investment in the UK is very high, on some calculations almost as high as 50%, though it fluctuates a little. But foreign direct investment in Japan is very low, not much more than 4%. And at a time when national economies are increasingly internationally interdependent, this suggests that there must be some structural reason why Japan is less integrated into this aspect of the world economy. That lack of integration does seem to be one way, given that Japanese firms are rightly immensely competitive and successful in overseas markets and as overseas investors. I don't myself believe that the reason for the low level of foreign direct investment into Japan is because there are overt barriers to trade and investment from abroad, but I do think that the network of complex regulations, the tendency for Japan to insist on its own approval procedures for pharmaceuticals and medical devices, for example, the extent to which all economic activity in Japan still has to be regulated and controlled by central or local government, acts as a bar or as a disincentive for the sort of free flow of investment that many other developed economies take for granted. So these are the issues that we think need to be addressed as and when we get into negotiations for an economic partnership agreement, and I hope that the Japanese government will do all they can to encourage the more skeptical countries in the European Union by giving clear undertakings of what can be discussed in those negotiations, and in advance some proof that excessive regulation is going to be tackled in a way which enables Japanese and foreign firms to invest more freely. These arguments, incidentally, are not just being made by foreign countries, they're being made by an increasing number of Japanese firms as well. It's always difficult to liberalize in this area because vested interests are at stake, and many of those vested interests, for example, in the area of agriculture, represent traditional constituencies of opinion and can be slow or reluctant to change. But if we are going to maximize our economic potential by working together, we do need to tackle these issues, and negotiations for an economic partnership agreement are the right context in which to do that. There are one or two other areas where our views and values, perhaps, slightly differ. The Foreign Office's work, British Foreign Ministry's work, is increasingly focused on areas of prosperity and security, but there is still a strong element of values-driven diplomacy as well. And one of the areas where worldwide we are seeking to change people's views is the death penalty. Now, Japan is one of the few developed countries in the world still to retain the death penalty, although the actual carrying out of executions in recent years has tended to depend on whether the Minister of Justice is willing to approve them or to operate a de facto moratorium. In Britain, the death penalty was abolished in the 1960s. This followed a long, intense, and deeply felt public campaign, strongly influenced by a number of obvious miscarriages of justice, where individuals who were innocent of any crime were executed for crimes they did not commit, and increasing public revulsion in some sections of the community from the ritual and the ceremony of the death penalty. Now, newspaper opinion polls in Britain from time to time reveal a high level of public support for the death penalty, and some people asking for it to be reintroduced. But there has been no credible or no serious or credible parliamentary movement for its reintroduction, and votes in Parliament taken at different times over the last 40 years have seen very large majorities to maintain its abolition. In other words, Parliament has assumed its responsibility as the legislative body to determine that this punishment should never be reintroduced. The same is true in all European Union countries where the death penalty is not in use. Now, of course, the decision on whether it should be retained in Japan is for Japanese politicians to make, but we have worked closely with lawyers and other Japanese groups with a special interest in this subject to contribute to the public debate, which appears to be beginning on this issue, and we hope, as this debate develops, that Japan will begin to move towards a position that reflects an increasing international consensus that the death penalty should be abolished worldwide. Another area where we are in close discussion with the Japanese government is over the ratification of the Hague Convention on Child Abduction. This is a technical legal issue, but a very emotive one, and it relates to the children of marriages or relationships between Japanese and foreign citizens, where the relationship has ended and a child or children have been taken by the Japanese parent back to Japan, and there is a dispute over their custody. The Hague Convention, which all other G7 major developed countries have ratified, provides an international framework within which cases of disputed custody can be resolved. Japan has not so far ratified it, but the Japanese government have indicated that serious consideration is now being given to its possible ratification, perhaps at some point next year. We very much hope that ratification can take place, and we welcome the Japanese government's desire to move towards that. We want to be in a position to ensure that British nationals in future such cases have recourse to an international legal framework of this kind. And of course, Japanese citizens also have an interest in being part of an agreed framework that supports their interests as well as those of the other parent, where cases arise of Japanese children being taken to other countries. So this is an area where I think our values are common, but our legal approach may differ somewhat. So our hope is that Japan will align itself with the legal framework that applies in other developed countries across the world. I've gone into a little bit of detail about these issues because I wanted to give you an idea of the more detailed work of the embassy as well as to discuss international relations in the round. There's always a tendency, and I understand it very well, for people to think of diplomats as living in a rather rarefied, unreal world, discussing subjects that have little relevance to the daily lives of the peoples in their respective countries. But nothing, in my view, could be further from the truth. And as I hope I've shown in this talk, international relations and foreign policy concerns are absolutely indistinguishable from domestic policy concerns. At the heart of what we do is the promotion of good business links. Contacts of this kind create wealth and jobs. Wealth and jobs create stability. And in a globalized economic world, this is not a zero-sum game where we're all in competition for limited resources, but an opportunity for us to create international prosperity that crosses borders and supports the peaceful resolution of difficult international issues. Let me now conclude my remarks with some general observations. The Foreign Office, which I worked for under the new British coalition government, has concentrated its responsibilities in three main areas. Prosperity, which I've talked about at some length, security, which is about the defence of Britain, but also development of collective defence relationships with its allies and contributing to international objectives to make the world a safer place. And our third priority is to support and help British people travelling throughout the world through our consular services. And that's why I talked about our work with Japan on the Hague Convention and on other issues. The basis of everything we do is to maintain and strengthen the partnership between Britain and Japan. Nowhere in recent months has that been more graphically demonstrated than in the outpouring of sympathy and assistance from people in Britain to people in Japan following the terrible events of March this year. The admiration that so many people in Britain felt for the courage, stoicism, resilience of the Japanese people when faced with this triple crisis of a massive earthquake, a devastating tsunami, and the nuclear accident at Fukushima. It's at times of deep adversity that the full strength of feeling between peoples and between countries can be expressed. Of course, it should not take such a tragedy for such feelings and respect to emerge, but the reality is that we have all felt humbled by the response of the Japanese people to these tragic events. And this has redoubled our conviction that we must protect and strengthen the close relationship between us in the future. I've talked about the nature of international relations, why they matter, how the structure of international affairs has changed over the last 100 years or so, and the relationship between Britain and Japan, which remains strong and positive, with some areas where we hope to see some development in the future to make it even stronger and even more of a long-term partnership of values. And I hope this has been a little helpful in setting out what diplomats do and why I think this activity continues to matter. There's a tendency at a time of rapid change, particularly as a lot of international activity moves away from traditional government-to-government links, to assume that governments, nations, the relations between them cease to matter as much as they did. It's a very simplistic analysis, and I think it is wrong. The big problems that face us all, that face the world, can only be resolved by governments working together. Those governments need to understand, as all democratic governments should understand, what the concerns and priorities are of the people that they represent. And they need to ensure that they get the right balance between promoting their national interests and working for a higher common factor of international prosperity and security. That's why diplomacy is such a fascinating and, I believe, valuable activity, and why I'm not only delighted to be a diplomat, but to be able to talk to you today about how that value and importance is likely to continue in the future. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
We would now like to open the floor to questions. If you would like to ask a question in English or in Japanese, either, please raise your hand and someone will come to you with a microphone. Yeah.
Thank you for your speech. Thank you very much. I'm very impressed your speech, and I have a question. And you talked about one kind of United Asian nations. So please tell me your opinion about which countries should be included in the United Asian nations.
Thank you very much. Well, the four candidates, I think, for permanent membership of the United Nations, in addition to the 5 permanent members, just to recap for everybody in the audience, because I didn't go into this detail in my speech, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and China and Russia. And these were the 5 countries that were victorious at the end of the Second World War. But if we are looking now at economic power and regional responsibility, then the argument is very strong for Japan as one of a group of 4 countries, the others are Germany, India and Brazil, to become permanent members of the Security Council with the rights and responsibilities of that permanent membership, which primarily means a veto over the Security Council's resolutions and deliberations. Now, there's a very long process going on in New York at the United Nations to discuss how the Security Council might be expanded and whether the expansion should include not only the countries that I've mentioned, but also countries representing regional interests of other continents. How do you represent the interests of Africa, for example, is one of the questions which people ask. And if you then expand the Security Council to include a much larger number of permanent members, does it become unwieldy? Does it become difficult to manage? Do you have permanent membership, or do you maybe have different categories of permanent membership? So some people spend a certain amount of time on the council, other people spend longer. Do you maintain the veto in its present form? That's a difficult subject to assess. At some point, of course, some countries may well say, why are there, if you make Germany a permanent member, why do you have 3 members of Europe, 3 countries from Europe on the Security Council? That's a question which will need to be answered. The process of deciding how the Security Council might be expanded is a long and complicated one, and I'm neither an expert on it, nor am I very close to the details of the discussions, which I think are going to take some years. My basic point, however, is that we believe that Japan should be there, because Japan is a country that has an enormous amount to contribute to the effective management of the world of international relations and permanent membership of the Security Council, as opposed to occasional membership of the Security Council, because there are countries that are elected for 1 or 2 years onto the Security Council at regular intervals would provide.
Thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much.
Yes, down in the front. Just a moment.
Hello, my name is Mio Okajima. Thank you very much for having a wonderful speech for us. I would like to ask one question. Since there was a great disaster in this March, and I think it's our generation to recover for the future, so I would like to ask what we university students should do to recover for Japan. Should we study or go abroad more, or do you have any hints or any ideas?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I'm making this speech in the presence of your teachers, so I think they would want me to say you should study. You should all study very hard. We should all study. But the important point to remember there is that we are not just studying at university, we are studying all our lives. The idea of studying lifelong learning is now tremendously important. I am still studying at my age, and once I retire from being a diplomat, I expect to go on studying for the rest of my life, because learning is a process that you do forever, not just for 3 or 4 years at university. I think traveling abroad is very important. One of the things which has worried me greatly since I came back to live in Japan 3 years ago is the reduction in the number of young people studying overseas. There are various statistics which have been quoted to prove this. The most worrying was the fact that last year, I think it was last year, there was 1 Japanese student at Harvard University, one Japanese freshman at Harvard. I don't know how many Chinese or Korean freshmen there were at Harvard, but it was certainly more than 1. So that can't be right. And there were various reasons for it, some of which were technical, to do with people not wanting to be away from Japan when employers were recruiting for jobs. But part of it was, I think, a psychological turning inwards. One of the words which I hear used most frequently in Japan over the past 3 years is uchimuke, this sense of being rather introspective, rather introverted, rather worried, a little depressed perhaps about the state of the world and Japan's place in it. We have to together to tackle that and to make people more confident about living, traveling, studying abroad. I also want to bring British students to Japan. I'm delighted that there are a number of British students at Chuo University, some of whom I hope may be here today. That type of exchange is tremendously important. And maybe that will help to cure another sense that I have had in the last 3 years of Japan as a less confident country. I travel very widely in Japan. I talk to a lot of people in different walks of life. We have a large number of visitors to the embassy from Britain, and I always introduce them to a wide range of people. And the common themes of those discussions tend to be, why is Japan not more successful? What can we do about our economy? It's too static. What can we do about our politics? We don't like our politicians. What can we do about our business? It's no longer competitive. To an outside observer, this seems terribly depressive for a country that is so successful and respected in the world. And Japan is an enormously highly respected in the world. You are respected for the quality of your manufacturing, for the quality of your science, for the quality of your research, for your innovation, for your creativity and soft power, as it's now called, your art, your culture, modern and traditional. And this year, in terrible circumstances, Japan has been enormously respected for its courage and its resilience, as I said. All of these things should make Japan a confident, not an unconfident country. And I think more young people traveling and studying abroad and experiencing other countries will contribute to that sense of confidence. So I do urge everybody to go abroad and study. And come to Britain particularly. 特に英国でしょ。
Especially to UK.
One more question. Yeah.
Thank you for your stimulative lecture. I'm Shigeki Iwamura. I am a student of law faculty, and I'd like to ask you about how United Kingdom maintains the nation status in EU and international relationship. And I think working together with other countries is very important. But to join a huge community like EU, have possibility to decline of status influence in the community. I think United Kingdom have kept influence in EU and international relationships. So the experience of United Kingdom teach a lesson for Japan to create a community in East Asia like EU. So I'd like to ask you this point. Thank you.
Thank you. A very, very good question. The United Kingdom joined the European Economic Community, as it was then called, in 1973. And it was quite a controversial development because there were people in Britain who felt that they were worried about pooling sovereignty. There were people in Britain who felt that Europe was a lower priority than maintaining strong relationships with the United States. Or in some cases, though these tended to be slightly older people, I think, that maintaining closer relationships with the traditional Commonwealth countries that had been part of the British Empire, though the empire ceased to exist back in the 1940s. And so there were differences of view in the British population about where the emphasis of Britain's relationships should be. But the strong argument for joining the European Union was not just that we were neighbours, not just that we were part of a community trying to put the Second World War behind us and find the basis for continued security and peaceful living together, but because Europe was essentially Britain's largest trading partner, its largest export market, its largest then source of investment, and there were strong economic reasons for us to manage the development of a European community as part of the process and not as a country which was distant from the process. And of course that involves negotiations, and negotiations involve compromises if the parties to the negotiation are ultimately to be successful, because most human interaction requires a degree of compromise and requires people to concede some points in order to win other points. In the European Union, with 27 member states, that can be quite complicated, but this is part of the price that you pay for being part of a successful project of peaceful collective security. In the case of the United Kingdom, we have found that the development of the European Union has become flexible enough for us to become part of certain projects which we think are crucial to our interests, like a single market for goods and services, and not to become part of certain projects which we think are not appropriate for our interests, like, for example, becoming a member of the common currency, the Eurozone, or becoming part of the common visa immigration boundaries. We are not a member of the Euro, and we are not going to join the Euro in the lifetime of this Parliament, and we are not a member of what is called the Schengen Union, which is the common external frontier for immigration purposes. We decided we wanted to be outside those two areas of common activity, and we have been able to negotiate our detachment from them successfully with our partners. And other member states are also able, as they wish, to be part of or not part of certain aspects of the Union as it is developed. But obviously this is a process of give and take, and you don't, I think, stand any chance of being influential in a debate of that kind if you don't enter the debate. So you've got to be part of the Union in order to exert influence over it, and I also believe that our influence and relevance to our major partners like Japan and the United States and other countries is a direct function of our ability to influence discussions within the European Union too.
Thank you. I'm afraid we are running short of time. We'll have to close the questions and answers here. Could I ask you to please remain seated while the ambassador leaves the hall? Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much.